Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakio, and the title of today's talk is Suffering a Bad Thing? But before we get into that, I'll remind you to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. And if you want to do a deep dive into Buddhist training, check out my book, Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. There's a link to a sample chapter of the book in the description for this talk, and it's available wherever books are sold. So here in the West, we have what's called a hedonic framework for dealing with the world, which simply put means that suffering is bad, pleasure is good. And when we make moral choices, we try to make choices that will increase our pleasure and decrease our suffering in day-to-day life. And this seems pretty good on the surface. No one enjoys suffering. We all want to enjoy our lives and experience pleasure. However, there's a problem, and that is no experience is pleasurable 100% of the time. And there are some experiences that are not pleasurable that we have to deal with whether we want to or not. So maybe we have a job we don't enjoy, but we have to keep it because it allows us to pay our bills. So we're trapped in our suffering. And there are other things that are very pleasurable but cause suffering later on. So the pleasure is only temporary. So we go out with friends or family and we have an all-night bender, we get very drunk, and we have a good time, but then we wake up and we have a terrible hangover. And maybe we said and did some things while we were drunk that we later regret. So if we have this hedonic framework of this hedonic model that we use to deal with life, where suffering is bad and pleasure is good, we're always hopping from one foot to another, and we never experience peace or satisfaction. And philosophers have worked for thousands of years to try to solve this riddle of the human condition. And I personally like the solution that Buddha arrived at 2,600 years ago. In the Four Noble Truths, Buddha said, life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. The way to end suffering is to end desire. The way to end desire is the Noble Eightfold Path. And the two key points we're going to focus on today are life is suffering and suffering is caused by desire. Now, if we have this idea that suffering is bad, then Buddhism becomes a terribly pessimistic, nihilistic philosophy. If life is suffering and suffering is bad, Buddha is saying that life is bad. But we have to understand that Buddha had a very different understanding of suffering than we do here in the West. For him, it wasn't good or bad. In fact, it was that value judgment that created the problems, not the suffering itself. For Buddha, suffering is just suffering. It's just part of life. It's something we experience in our day-to-day, and it's something we need to grow up and be mature enough to simply interact with skillfully. To put it a different way, imagine the sun, a star millions of light years away that is single-handedly responsible for all life on Earth. Without the sun, there could be no plants. Without the plants, there could be no animals. Without the animals, there could be no us. So on one hand, you might think the sun is very good. And yet, if we go out in the sun for too long, we can get terrible sunburns. We can get dehydrated and die. If there's too much sun over too many days and not enough rain, those plants that we care about so much will die. So on the other hand, maybe the sun is very bad, but it can't be both at the same time, can it? No, from the Buddhist perspective, the sun isn't good or bad. It's simply the sun. And it's how we interact with the sun that determines whether we suffer or not. Similarly, it's how we interact with our suffering that determines whether we suffer or not. The suffering is neutral. We're the problem. and we are the solution. So, in the first noble truth, where Buddha is saying life is suffering, he's telling us we should experience our suffering in the same way we experience the sun. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just something we have to deal with. And if we deal with it skillfully, it can actually work in our favor. And then the second noble truth, where he says suffering is caused by desire, he's simply reminding us that it's our desire to not suffer that causes us to suffer. So, for example, if we have a sink full of dirty dishes, it's not the dishes that cause us suffering, it's us and our desire to not have to do the dishes that causes us suffering. If we just go and we knock it out, maybe we play some pleasant music or we call a friend and have a conversation on speakerphone, the dishes take care of themselves. And then we have a nice clean kitchen to look at. Making the bed can be a source of suffering if we desire to not have to do it. But if we simply accept that making the bed is part of life and we simply do it out of habit because that's what we do in the morning, it's not a big deal. And it's actually a source of happiness because now we have a nice made up bed to come home to in the evening. So to refresh, suffering is not good or bad. It's our value judgments around suffering, around life in general, that creates suffering. If we simply accept it as a part of our experience in the same way that we accept the sun, suffering can actually be quite pleasurable. And I'll let you think on that for a while, but that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. If you'd like to read articles I've written on Buddhist practice, you can do that at my blog, The Same Old Zen. The link for that is in the description for this talk. And if you'd like to continue the discussion, please leave a comment in the comment section. I love to hear from you guys, and I promise I'll respond. So that's it for today. Until next time, Amitabha.